Hello, I made this video today to talk about some of the sprites in my platform game, my thinking behind them. There's a process video where I talk through how I draw and some of the tools I use and some of the things I take into account. That should be on the blog. This video is concerned with the sprites that I made and my thoughts on them. So starting off with the main sprite, Max, who is of course the hero of the story. Max started out as a fairly kind of benevolent character. He was a gardener, and I always had this idea that I wanted this planet with trees that were hundreds of feet high, with oversized insects and various wildlife and oversized elements of nature and undersized humans. And I had this idea that Max would be he would live in a village at the base of the trees, and he would tend the garden in the daytime, and he would invent things in his spare time. And when this magpie character steals all the diamonds in the village, it's up to Max to begin the climb to the magpie's nest to retrieve what was stolen. So, although Max started out as a very gentle, benevolent, almost kind of soft character, quite cute, I decided that with what lay ahead of him, I wanted to make him a lot more dynamic and spirited and independent. And also, I wanted to give him some elements that made him not only iconic, but also helped him to stand out from everything that was going on the screen at the time. So after doing some concept sketches, I kind of whittled it down. I always had an idea that he would have this kind of oversized bug repellent or some kind of backpack projectile that he'd invented. And I wanted him to be a character that was not only strong and independent, but also quite fun and somebody that the player would want to spend time with. So I began drawing Max like this, giving this red hair to give him a sort of slightly kind of rebellious, punky, almost kind of teenage look to reflect his personality, quite adventurous, and also these large oversized goggles as well. And I think once I'd hit on those two elements of the design, I was able to create something that I was happy with. I would have liked to have put in some more animation frames, but unfortunately I was beaten by the clock on that one. So moving on to Max's companion, Jobot, who was a fairly late addition to the design process. And the reason Jobot was in the game was I needed something to block the exit before Max could collect all the diamonds. Once all the diamonds have been collected, Jobot disappears. But if there are still diamonds left to find on the level, Jobot will tell you that there are more gems to discover, and he will block the exit until you found them all. So I thought for a long time about how I could create something that fitted into the narrative of the game, but still was tied to Max somehow. And I had this idea that if he's an inventor, he might well have invented some sort of companion or robot, and it just seemed to be a good fit, really. So the animation sequence you can see here is basically all the sequences are GIFs, just a sequence of transparent GIFs or PNGs. So in this case, it's a sequence of 7 that will make Jobot hover up and down by repeatedly playing this animation backwards and forwards. Moving on to the enemies, which were quite fun to do. This first one was always intended as the first enemy that Max would meet in the game. Hence his sort of slightly dozy looking expression, and the fact that he doesn't really appear to present much of a threat. He's more there to get the player used to the kind of world that Max is entering. What I did discover while making the sprites was these domed bats on the insects, I realised that Max could use the insects as trampolines, which would add to the gameplay in its own right. I was pretty adamant quite early on that I didn't really want Max to be a particularly destructive kind of character or a killer, because it's not that kind of game, really. It's aimed at a much lower age bracket, and I wanted Max to obviously contend with these creatures, but not necessarily destroy them. Hence the reason Max's gun, it can be used on environmental objects, but not on enemies. It's just something that I didn't want, really, and I felt like it was too obvious a design decision to have Max shoot his gun at these insects and kill them. Particularly as my age bracket was age 7 at its lowest. It's not really something that I wanted. I thought it'd be more fun and more clever as a game to have the player think about how he could use these objects as trampolines. One thing I would like to have done in my coding is somehow increased the jump speed when Max jumps onto the back of the insect, so it temporarily boosts him, but I couldn't unfortunately do that, so I had to stick with making puzzles in the game that relied on the insect's height, so Max could think about how he could use the placing of the insect to jump up to the next level, almost like using it as a step. So this first insect, quite slow. This second enemy, slightly quicker. All produced in Photoshop, by the way. Photoshop, Illustrator, and good old pencil and paper, believe it or not. Scanned in and then drawn over with computer programs. This second insect is a little bit quicker and a little bit meaner and presents a little bit more of a threat, but also slightly larger as well. And as Max progresses through the game, I wanted each enemy to grow progressively slightly bigger than the last one. So moving on to the third enemy, who by now is significantly bigger than the first two, and starts, for me, to give me a little bit more leeway on how I can make interesting levels that make use of the insect's height. So this caterpillar creature is a good example of how I incorporated platforms into the game that were also enemies. The next one up is this slug character. Again, he's got his mouth open with this kind of leering, slightly threatening expression, because I actually wanted him to have some sort of artificial intelligence in the coding and shoot projectiles at Max, but I just couldn't figure out how it was done. So I had to create a game really that was interesting and fun, but within the limitations of my coding ability at this stage. I'm sure if I had more time on the clock, I could have sat down and figured out how it was done, but I might well have sacrificed other areas of the game design to do that, which wasn't something I was keen to do. This next enemy appears when Max enters a beehive to climb all the way to the top, and it's the first introduction of the game of horizontally moving enemies rather than vertical ones. Vertical rather than horizontal. I wanted it to be more of a random flight pattern originally, but I couldn't figure out how that was done either. So I just had to create groups of them that moved up and down, almost like barriers that Max had to negotiate. And this spider works in exactly the same way, but it's just slightly quicker. I thought I had enough enemies in the game to give an interesting balance and an interesting mix. And obviously the main enemy in the game is the magpie that has stolen the diamonds from Max, and she appears as the end of game boss. she has a number of different attack patterns in that one room, which was a challenge in itself. And it took a good couple of days of sitting down and figuring out a way of doing it that was within my limitations. All of that is in another video where I show you the technique that I used and how these sprites that you see on the screen of Magpie. Magpie's a first attack pattern, second attack pattern, sorry, and final attack pattern are incorporated into the room. I was quite happy with this sprite. I thought it looked quite interesting. It bore a close resemblance to the concept art that I did originally. I think the challenge was getting it to fit into the game world that I'd created, so it didn't look like it stood out like a sore thumb too much. If I could do it again, I think I would probably lessen some of the black lines, because some of the other insects, if we go to, say, the spider above it, they seem slightly more subtle with their black lines and the way they've been drawn. But I guess on the other hand, I wanted to create a very animated film kind of effect. So my thinking was to have these kind of painterly backgrounds and hand-drawn animated sprites over the top. And it does give the game a very distinctive visual look. But I'm just a bit concerned that the evidence of it being hand-drawn is a bit too much here. So I might go back and revisit that at a later stage. These are some of the environmental sprites in the game. These are the blocks that Max can climb on. One of the projectiles at the end of the game, projectile that comes from Max's gun. These blocks, this grey block here, they're destructible, and these two cannot be interacted with at all. My main kind of piece of original thinking in the game, if you like, was that yes, it is a platform game, but I wanted Max to be able to make the platforms himself, which is where his backpack comes in. It fires two shots. It fires a purple shot, which can destroy certain blocks like this grey one. It fires a yellow shot, which will fly through the air and expand on impact and solidify, so you can stack up these yellow shots and make platforms, which we'll have a look at in a minute in one of the animation sequences. But I thought these were good pieces of work, particularly the bark on these, which gives a very woodland kind of effect and carries on the whole idea of nature. This is one of the diamonds that Max has to collect, done in Illustrator, and I did it in Illustrator because diamonds tend to have very sharp edges. And the main difference between Illustrator and Photoshop is pixel based and Illustrator is vector based, and with vectors you can get much sharper, cleaner lines. And I just thought that was an appropriate use of software for creating this kind of object, really. If I was to do it in Photoshop, I would probably get slightly fuzzy lines or a slight pixelation, which would probably take away from the hard edge surface of the diamond. Similarly, these blocks were done in Illustrator as well, because sometimes producing vector-based artwork with this kind of level of detail in it is a lot quicker to do in Illustrator with the tools, the pen tool, to make simple primitive shapes, and then I can overlap them and use the pathfinder to subtract them and pull them apart and keep these sharp edges. So it's quite a quick process to do, really. You can just kind of almost switch your mind off and just get on with it. Doesn't really require a lot of thought, but the edges are very, very good. I'd like to talk a little bit now about some of the projectiles in the game. Again, you can see these were done in Illustrator because of their very, very sharp edges, and also why a lot of them didn't end up making it into the game. For example, this original one, this kind of flamethrower kind of attack that was supposed to be one of Max's power ups that he could collect. I just thought it was too violent, and it wasn't really appropriate for the kind of game and the kind of age audience that I was aiming at. So that ended up being cut from the game. I had other ideas where Max's backpack would be interchangeable with various sorts of insecticide or chemical shot, or even weapons that would work specifically with certain kinds of enemies. For example, when Max enters the beehive, he would be given a smoke machine to ward them off. Again, they're kind of interesting ideas, but once this one, the platform gameplay mechanic went in, it just made the game interesting, and it didn't seem to need lots and lots of power-ups to kind of pad that out. It created interesting gameplay in its own right. So I made the decision just to have two sorts of projectile that Max could permanently use. A purple one to fight his way through certain parts of the environment, and the yellow one for creating platforms. And everything else, it just seemed a bit superfluous, really. So that's why I ended up not using it. If we go to my processes, and we can have a look at some of the weapons that were originally supposed to be in the game. These were Max's projectiles. The concept art for them, this one was supposed to be a simple kind of low-level weapon that Max would start the game out with. This one is more like a kind of a backpack that shoots acid or some kind of long-range projectile, or it can spray over large areas. It was an interesting idea. Again, I think, in all honesty, I was slightly limited by my programming on Game Maker at this stage, which kind of upset me a little bit for a while, because I really wanted to build these into the game. But after a while, I realised that with just the platform shot, that is what made the game what it was. The fact that the player had to think about how to use the platform projectile to solve the various puzzles in the game. So kind of the concept changed from being an action game to a platform puzzler. This one would have been the smoke machine that I talked about earlier. This one would have been the flamethrower, again incorporating an element of humour and nature with this tiny firefly in the top powering it. I thought it was very, very important to include some sort of humour in all the sprites I was doing, because I just wanted it to be just a bit of kind of cartoon fun, really, and not a game that takes itself too seriously. This one, I was kind of thinking about old sweet dispensers and candy machines when I drew it, and certainly the back part does resemble that, and it's full of these seeds that to provide the ammunition for this kind of Gatling gun. It's almost a bit like the power lifter from the end of Aliens. Again, it was an interesting idea, and I think if I were to expand the game out, that might have made it in there. Maybe as a very, very end of game boss, you'd be given this kind of final weapon, maybe, to take on this big bad guy. I actually had the idea that Jobot, the little robot companion, was going to kind of airlift in projectiles and drop them onto the game's map so Max could pick them up. But as it turns out, Jobot was just a useful way to provide a block to the exit, and I think he served his purpose quite well. He's a nice little design. he fits in well with Max's backstory of being an inventor quite nicely. What I did want though, and I'm kind of sad that I ran out of time doing this, I did want a level where there are no platforms at all, and I just wanted some kind of enhancement to Max's backpack. There was almost like a gyrocopter or a helicopter, and it would just continue his way upwards, but just by flying, just at least for one level. I thought it would provide a nice bit of variety and break things up. Joebot, I was thinking he could have been like a little kind of transformer kind of robot, and attached himself to Max's backpack and created this add-on propeller, if you like. But that was a little bit further on in the design process, and it's certainly, with more time, it's something that I would have done, I think. Originally though, I was going to have this little kind of gyrocopter thing that you could pick up on the map, and it would provide a way for the player to negotiate some very, very difficult bits of the game that would be absolutely swarming with enemies, and this thing would be the only way through. Didn't make it into the game, but there you go. I think I made the right design decision by just sticking with a platform projectile, because it really defines the kind of game that you're playing, rather than trying to throw everything in there and maybe trying to appeal to everybody and end up pleasing nobody. And there would be a danger of it turning into a bit of a mishmash of ideas. So I streamlined my ideas, and I was very happy with what I did. We can have a look at some of the sprite animations. This one was for when Max fires his projectile. You can see that you've got this yellow shot that appears from the barrel of his weapon, and as it flies through the air, it expands, and when it hits things, it stays static. You can also get rid of them with the purple shot, and when you hit them with this static object splits, and then splits again, and then splits again. And I realised by splitting and splitting, you could eventually make it disappear. And when it's played at speed, I think it's quite an effective piece of animation. The same with the grey destructible blocks that Max can destroy. I use the same technique, because the frames move so fast that the viewer's eye can't see the joins in the sprites, so it creates quite a fluid little effect. This was the first magpie attack pattern at the end of the game, where she flies in from the background, and I realised that you could create a moving object, but you could also make that moving object expand in its size, as if something was flying at you from the distance, and then getting bigger and bigger, and then just swooping up over Max's head. And I think between this small frame here and this large frame here, there's about 40 or so animation frames in between. And the end effect in the boss fight, I was really, really happy with. If anything, if I was going to change anything, I think I would have gone even bigger, so it flies not just at Max, but at the player. This is about 1,000 pixels across, and probably would have gone to about 1,500. So it gets really, really huge, and the magpie really gets up in your face as the player. But I talk about that in one of my other videos, where I talk about objects and my thinking with some of the programming, and also I've done a video for this boss fight where I talk through exactly how I made each phase of the attack pattern. So I've come to the end of this video now. If you would like to know how I made any of these, and the techniques that I used and the processes that I used, they're all on another video which should be on my blog.